Welcome to Decoding Finnish History. My name is Jukka Uusitalo. Today I am going to read you a chapter from the 1830 book, The Cabinet Geography Volume 1, by the author Dionysius Lardner, Geography of the Middle Ages. Book 3, Chapter 1, Discoveries of the Northmen. The nations of the north, however rude and barbarous they might appear in the eyes of the luxurious Romans, were yet raised far above the abject condition of an utter indifference to knowledge. The kindred races of the German and Sclavonian nations were very extensively diffused. Their free polity and restless disposition maintained a perpetual intercourse between them. And even the nature of the country which they occupied seems to warrant the conclusion that the geographical knowledge possessed by the northern nations was never circumscribed within such narrow limits as those which confined the views of the early inhabitants of Greece and Italy. In all the accounts that remain to us of Scandinavia, from the age of Pythias to that of Alfred, we meet with none but Gothic names. Again, the Scandinavian mythology preserved in the Edda presents only those physical traits which properly belong to northern climates, and those usages which are found only among a warlike and a maritime people. Thus, a northern god invents the art of skating, and the mortal remains of a deified hero are consumed on a vessel launched out to sea. Even in Valhalla, the clashing of arms is heard amid the festivities, and mead takes the place of nectar at the table of Odin. All these circumstances, poetical, geographical, and mythological, combine to prove that from the remotest times, Scandinavia, properly so called, has been in the occupation of a single people. But to the east of these hereditary possessions of the Goths wandered the nomad tribes of Scythians and Sarmatians. Much information respecting these resulted from the Scandinavian expeditions of the 10th and 12th centuries. Till the year 1157, Finland was the resort of savages who lived by piracy and who were known by the names of Finns and Kyriels. The Finns, who in the 1st century, as it appears from the description of Tacitus, were established in the north of Poland, had fixed themselves before the 16th century in the country which at present bears their name. It appears indeed that colonies of that people penetrated even into some districts of Scandinavia. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Gulf of Finland was called Kirjala-Botten. It was a principal theater of action to the Scandinavian pirates. The Swedes, being converted to Christianity, turned their arms in the 12th and 13th centuries against the inhabitants of Finland and the north of Russia. These zealous crusaders, by a blunder suited to the ignorance of the age, gave to the savages, who were the objects of their warfare, the name of Saracens. Conrad, Duke of Masovia, in a letter written in 123, summoned the German knights to war against his pagan neighbors, whom he calls the Prussians and other Saracens. This name occurs again, torn completely from the claims of geography, in an old romance on the birth and adventures of the enchanter Merlin, in which even the Anglo-Saxons are called Saracens. It appears to have been during this period that the city of Abo was founded in the middle of Finland. It was called in Finnish Turku, from the Swedish word torg, which signifies a marketplace. The sound of this name misled Adam of Bremen into the belief that there were Turks in Finland. The intrepid seamen of the north harassed by their piracies the shores of Armorica and defied the power of the Roman Empire. The earliest account of the services rendered to geography by those hardy adventurers has been preserved to us by King Alfred, whose reign extended from 872 to 901. That great prince translated into the Anglo-Saxon tongue the geography of Orosius, a Spanish monk who flourished in the beginning of the 5th century. But Alfred, in order that the work might be more complete, added to the translation the narratives of 2 contemporary travelers in the north of Europe. One of these was Ottar, a Norwegian nobleman who sought a refuge at the court of Alfred from the civil wars and disturbances of his native country. He was esteemed in his own country a man of great wealth, and possessed 600 tame deer, besides 6 decoy deer and 20 head of cattle. He also received an annual tribute from the Finns, which was paid in valuable furs, feathers, whalebone, and ship cables made of the skins of seals. Thus it appears that the manners of the North were nearly the same 1,000 years ago as they are at present. Ottar dwelt in Heligoland, the most northern part of Norway, on the shores of the Western Sea. The country to the north of his habitation was waste and uninhabited, with the exception of a few spots to which the Finns resorted in the summer season to hunt or fish. Being desirous to know how far that uninhabited country extended towards the north, he sailed northwards along the coast, keeping the open sea always on the larboard or left hand of his course. 3 days' sail brought him as far to the north as the whale fishers were used to go. He continued his voyage, however, for 3 days longer, and then found that the coast, instead of running to the north as hitherto, turned towards the east. Following this coast for 4 days, he found it again bending to the south, and sailing due south for 5 days, he came to the country of the Bjormians or Permians, who appeared to him to speak the same language as the Finns. Thus it appears that Ottar sailed round the north of Europe into the White Sea, on the eastern side of which was the country of the Permians, at present possessed by the Samoyeds. Curiosity was not the only motive of his voyage. He had also in view the pursuit of the walrus, or horse whale, as King Alfred correctly translates it, which were extremely valuable not only on account of their tusks, which made fine ivory, but also for their strong and pliant skins. In the White Sea he found these animals so numerous that his party succeeded in killing 60 in 3 days. Ottar was also acquainted with the navigation of the Baltic. He mentions Sehon egg or Scania, and Besinga egg or Blekingia, with the countries of the Angles, Saxons, and Wends. Kvenland, or the country of the Quens, was situated between the White Sea and the Gulf of Bothnia. The resemblance of that national designation to the Scandinavian word queen, which signifies a woman, led many writers of the Middle Ages to believe that there was a country of Amazons in the north. Thus ignorance and the resemblance of names peopled the north with Amazons, with Saracens and Turks. Wulfstan, the other Norman whose travels are related by King Alfred, visited more particularly the eastern shores of the Baltic. To the east of Northmen, or the country of the Wends, and Wit and or Prussia, was the river Wisla, or Vistula, and all beyond that was called by the general name of Estum, or Estland. Icelandic sagas mention, besides, Pulinaland, or Poland, and Gardarike, or the Empire of the City, the proud title once borne by Novgorod. The Don is named by the oldest Icelandic writer Svanakvist, which probably signifies the river of the steppes or desert. In Estland, or modern Russia, there were, according to Wulfstan, a great number of towns, in each of which there was a king. The country abounded in honey, and had plenty of fish, The kings and nobility drank mare's milk, while the slaves and poor people used only mead, for they brewed no ale, but had mead in profusion. Among the singular customs of the Estlanders, observed by the Norman, was that of distributing the effects of those who died, not to the relations of the deceased, but among the best riders at his funeral. After the body was placed upon the pile, all the property of the deceased was divided into heaps, 5, 6, or more in number, according to its value. These heaps were placed at equal intervals from each other, and regularly increased in size, so that the largest and most valuable was at the greatest distance from the town. Then all who had fleet horses were invited to attend and strive for the prizes. The heaps were won by the swiftest in the race. Ireland was discovered by the Northmen so early as the 7th century. Such at least is the account given by the northern historians. But it is hard to avoid suspecting in this, as in other similar cases, that many distant voyages were undertaken, and geographical discoveries made, long before those of which the memory is preserved. It is certain, however, that in the 7th century, the northern pirates made frequent descents on the coast of Ireland for the sake of pillage. They even established their authority in the island and exacted tribute. At a later period, AD 964, the Northmen took possession of the Isles of Shetland, Jet, and Orhjaltland, which constituted for some time a part of the earldom of the Orkneys. These pirates obtained a perfect acquaintance with this archipelago. They hunted down and exterminated the original inhabitants, called Peti or Papai, who were probably the Picti of the ancients. They added to this insular dominion a considerable portion of the north of Scotland, and their monuments are still among the most conspicuous in the highlands of that kingdom. The Northmen made the conquest of the Hebrides in the year 893, and gave them the name of the Suderir, or Southern Isles, in relation to the Orkneys. The Suderir were united with the Isle of Man in the same kingdom, and under the same ecclesiastical authority. Hence the bishopric of Sodor has been since always nominally united with that of Man. All these conquests made among the British Islands remained dependent on the Kingdom of Norway till the latter half of the 13th century. But the old Icelandic chronicles relate, moreover, that the Northmen discovered in the 9th century, to the west of Ireland, a great country, to which they gave the name of Great Ireland, or the White Man's Land. This alleged discovery is generally ranged by critics among fabulous traditions. But these surprising accounts of the early Scandinavian voyages have, after all, so little poetic decoration in their circumstances. They are so perfectly free in their general design from any admixture of the monstrous or absurd, that it is much more easy to believe the reality of the achievement than the invention of the story. It is not the character or the taste of a rude age to compose fictions with the air of truth. In the Landnama Bok, one of the oldest of the Icelandic histories, occurs the following sober reference to this great discovery in the West. Ari was the son of Mar of Reykjolar, and of Thor Katla, daughter of Hergils Hrapsson. He was cast on the shore of the White Man's Land, which others call the Great Ireland. It is situated in the Western Ocean, near the good Vinland. Here Ari, not being permitted to return, was detained and baptized. This was related by Raffin, the Limerick merchant, who had resided many years in Limerick. And besides this, Thorkil Gitsen said he had heard several Icelanders relate the same, who had been present when Thorfinn, Earl of Orkneys, asserted that Ari had been seen in the white man's land, and although he did not get leave to return, was very much esteemed. Thus it appears that the Northmen carried on a trade with the west of Ireland, which will appear less surprising when it is considered that they were in possession of all the islands on that coast. Of the same doubtful character, but of a later age, is the voyage of the Welsh Prince Madoc, the son of Owain Gwynedd, who is stated in the Triads to have gone to sea in 10 ships with 300 men to avoid the dissensions of his brothers respecting the succession to the throne. This expedition was planned by Madoc and his brother Ririd in consequence of a prior one in 1170, wherein he discovered land in the ocean a great way to the west. No tidings were ever afterwards received of him, and this expedition was in consequence united in Welsh story with the voyages of Gawran and Myrddin under the title of the Three Disappearances. The Myrddin named here belonged to the 5th century. He went to sea in a house of glass, as tradition states it, accompanied by 9 Welsh bards. It can hardly be credited that Madoc should have sailed in the 12th century across the widest part of the Atlantic, for he left Ireland to the north. Yet Mr. Owen, the biographer of Wales, affirms that he has collected a multitude of evidences to prove that Madoc must have actually reached the American continent, for the descendants of that prince and his followers exist there as a nation to this day, and their present dwelling is on the southern branches of the Missouri River, where they are known under the appellations of Paducas, White Indians, Civilized Indians, and Welsh Indians. This last name, it may be presumed, they have received from the Cambrian antiquarians. About the year 861 accident conducted some Scandinavian pirates to the Faroe Islands, and immediately afterwards some adventurers of the same nation, while endeavoring to make their way to this newly discovered country, were thrown by a tempest on the eastern coast of Iceland, or as it was at first called, Snio-land. In 864 one Gardar circumnavigated the island, to which, in order to commemorate his labor, he gave the name of Gardarsholm. He stated with perfect correctness that it had a circumference of about 670 nautical miles. A few years later, Floke, a Norwegian, ventured to winter on the northern coast, where he remained 2 years. This experiment led to the colonization of Iceland, to which the political troubles of Norway at that time furnished additional motives, and Ingolf, one of the discontented party at home, set sail with a numerous retinue in 874, and settled in one of the green valleys on the southwestern coast of that island. The first settlers in Iceland found extensive districts of that dreary country covered with forests of birch and fir. They were also able, notwithstanding the severity of the climate, to cultivate some barley and other grain. At present, the whole island is a naked desert, the native woods having totally disappeared, and the Icelanders have long since relinquished, for good reasons it may be presumed, the practice of growing corn. But it is not manifest whether these changes are to be ascribed to an alteration in the climate, or whether they ought not rather to be considered as the natural consequences of the multiplication of cattle. One of the most remarkable circumstances attending the discovery of Iceland is that relics were found there, which showed that it had been previously inhabited. The nature of these relics, which consisted of bells, wooden crosses, and books in the Irish character, induced the Norwegians to believe that those prior visitants were Christians, either from Scotland or from Ireland. Many authors have endeavored to throw discredit on this account, influenced perhaps by the ordinary unwillingness of men to admit facts which they are unable to explain. There is not any inherent improbability in the opinion that the Scandinavians and the inhabitants of the British Islands navigated the northern seas for ages before their proceedings were known to history. But the most ancient of the Icelandic chronicles are not contented with mentioning the vestiges of former inhabitants. They distinctly state that there were actual settlements on the island previous to the Norwegian emigration. They name Kirkjubøy, one of the warm and fertile valleys that occur on the southern coast, as the residence of those paps, as they call the strangers who deserted the island. It is added from their aversion to the pagan colonists. The colonization of Iceland by the bold and adventurous Northmen was soon followed by further discoveries in the west. One Erik Rauda, or Redhead, the son of Thorwald, a Norwegian noble, quarreled with and killed his neighbor Eyolf. For this and other offenses he was condemned to a banishment of 3 years. He knew that a man named Gunnbjorn had previously discovered some banks to the west of Iceland, from him called Gunnbjorn Sheran, or Gunnbjorn's Banks, and likewise a country of great extent still farther to the west. He determined to employ the time of his exile in making a voyage of discovery to that country. Setting sail, therefore, from Iceland, he soon fell in with a point of land, which he called Hirjalf's Ness, and continuing his voyage to the southwest, he entered a deep inlet, to which he gave the name of Erikssund, and passed the winter on a pleasant island in the neighborhood. In the following year, he explored the continent, and returning to Iceland in the 3rd year, he represented his new discovery in the most favorable light, enlarging in his praises of its fine woods, rich meadows, and abundant fisheries. And the better to confirm the impression made by these embellished accounts, he gave to the newly discovered country the alluring name of Greenland. By these arts, he contrived to draw together a considerable company, who embarked under his guidance, carrying with them household furniture, implements of all kinds, cattle for breeding, and whatever else is necessary for the establishment of a colony. But of 25 ships which set sail, not more than 14 arrived in safety. These first adventurers were soon followed by many more from Iceland and Norway. Greenland, according to most of the Icelandic histories, was discovered in 982 and peopled 4 years later. Some, however, carry back the discovery to 932. Nay, there exists letters patent of Louis the Debonair in 834, and a bull of Gregory IV in 835, which confer on the Church of Hamburg, among other privileges, that of converting the heathen in Iceland and in Greenland. Are we to suppose, then, that the enterprising mariners of Hamburg had already, in the beginning of the 9th century, scoured the northern ocean, but that their discoveries, which held out but little temptation to the merchant, soon fell into oblivion? Or is it not likely that they still frequented the fisheries of those seas, but that the Icelanders, who cultivated literature in peace and preserved the history of their settlements, appear from this circumstance alone as the principal discoverers in the north? Many, it is true, consider the patents of the Church of Hamburg to be either forged or interpolated, But when criticism assumes so arbitrary a character, it cannot escape the suspicion of injustice. The new settlers in Greenland had their bishops from Europe and continued their intercourse with the parent state of Norway till the year 1418. The colony paid to the Pope an annual tribute of 2,600 pounds weight of walrus teeth as tithe and Peter's pence. There were 2 towns, Garda and Rattalid, yet the whole community did not equal the number of the smallest parish in Norway. The voyage to Greenland and back again sometimes occupied no less than 5 years. In the year 1383, a ship arrived in Norway bringing the first intelligence of the death of the Bishop of Greenland, which had taken place 6 years before. Thus it appears that however intrepid the northern seamen may have been, they were still but very imperfectly skilled in the arts of navigation. Greenland in the 10th century wore the same dreary appearance as at the present day. It seemed like a disordered accumulation of naked rocks and immense glaciers. Enormous icebergs, such as the Northmen had never seen in their original habitations, floated along the coast and filled every inlet. The stern aspect of nature in this inhospitable land, added to its extreme remoteness and the dangers of the boisterous seas through which it was reached, soon converted it, in the popular belief, into a land of wonders. The sea around was said to be inhabited by marine giants of both sexes, and the mountainous icebergs, as they moved along, were thought to be guided by invisible hands. It was said, too, that one Hollergeit walked from Norway to Greenland on the ice, conducted by a goat. The dreadful pestilence called the Black Death, which in the middle of the 14th century depopulated all Europe, and the north in particular, extended its ravages even as far as Greenland. The colony was, from this and other causes, much enfeebled. When in 1418 a hostile fleet arrived, no one could tell from what country it came, and destroyed everything with tire and sword. Soon after this event, the colony of Greenland disappeared totally from history. Some fruitless attempts were made in the 16th century to reach the ancient settlement, but the great barriers of ice that had formed along the coast rendered it impossible to attain the desired object. Nor was it till the year 1721 that the Danish colony at present existing in Greenland was established. The ruins of the old colony are still to be seen near the southern point of the peninsula. When the Northmen had crossed the tempestuous seas between Norway and Iceland, and from Iceland to Greenland, it might easily be conjectured that they would prosecute their discoveries still further to the westward. In the year 1001, an Icelander named Bjorn, sailing to Greenland to visit his father, was driven by a tempest far away to the southwest. He there saw a level country covered with wood. The wind abating, he steered northwest and reached his destination. His account inflamed the ambition of Leif, the son of that Erik Raude, who had founded the colony of Greenland. Our vessel was soon equipped. Leif and Bjorn set sail together and arrived at Tibby country, which the latter had described. The first land they reached was a rocky island, to which they gave the name of Helleland. A low country, thickly wooded, was called Markland. A few days afterwards they found a river, on the banks of which were trees loaded with agreeable fruits. The temperature appeared delicious, the soil seemed fertile, and the river yielded abundance of fine salmon. Having reached the lake from which the river issued, our Greenlanders resolved to winter in the country. They found that on the shortest day the sun remained 8 hours above the horizon, from which observation it results that they were not far from the 49th degree of latitude. A German, who made one of the party, found some wild grapes, and having explained to his companions the use to which that fruit was generally converted, it was agreed among them to give the newly discovered country the name of Vinland, or the land of wine. The relations of Leif made several voyages to Vinland. The third summer after the Normans landed there, they saw arrive, in canoes covered with leather, a number of natives of diminutive stature, to whom they gave the name of Skurselingues, or dwarfs. They massacred those comparatively feeble creatures without mercy, and were in consequence furiously attacked by the whole tribe. Some years afterwards, the Scandinavian colony carried on an advantageous fur trade with the savages, who appear from these accounts to have been Eskimo. The valuable fur trade which rewarded their enterprise induced numbers to follow their example. But we are very imperfectly informed with respect to the circumstances of the Scandinavian colonies established in Vinland. We only know that Eric, Bishop of Greenland, made a voyage to that country in 1121, in order to convert to Christianity his countrymen settled there, and who still continued pagans. It is impossible to shake the authenticity of these plain and circumstantial accounts, and it is likewise difficult, if not impossible, to acknowledge their genuine character, without admitting at the same time that Vinland was in Newfoundland, or else on the continent of North America, which was consequently discovered by Europeans nearly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus, in whose age, perhaps, some traditions were still preserved among seamen of those early discoveries in the north. In the year 1380, 2 noble Venetians, named Zeni, entered into the service of a prince of the Faroe Islands, and visited anew all the countries discovered by the Scandinavians, or at least they collected a circumstantial description of them, which confirms, in every material point, the Icelandic accounts, and which could hardly have been unknown to Columbus. In the map drawn by the Zeni to illustrate the account of their navigations, Iceland is represented with the 2 towns of Skalodin and Olensis, or Skalholt and Hola, which were in fact the 2 bishoprics. To the south of Iceland, and to the northeast of Scotland, is a great island, surrounded by many small ones. The whole group bears the name of Friesland, and is evidently intended for the Faroes land, or Faroe Islands. This natural interpretation, however, of the Italian voyages did not occur to our early navigators, who long sought in vain for the Friesland of the Zeni. Frobisher thought he had found it when he first described the southern point of Greenland, to which he accordingly gave the name of Friesland. To the north of Iceland, the Zeni place a great peninsula, in shape resembling Greenland, but joined on the east with Norway. The junction, however, is marked as merely conjectural. It is the same stated in the account of the navigation that Niccolo Zeno, going from Iceland, found a country, in the map called Engroniland, but in the text Engroneland and Grolandia. But the names of the places given in this country have no correspondence with those which occur in the Scandinavian topography of Greenland, so that there is good reason to doubt the accuracy of the Zeni. But in this country, which he calls Grolandia, Niccolo Zeno found a monastery of friar preachers, and a church dedicated to St. Thomas, not far from a mountain which threw out flames like an Etna and Vesuvius. In the same place there was a spring of boiling water, with which the monks warmed the church, the monastery, and their own apartments. They irrigated their gardens from these hot sources, and thus contrived to preserve a perpetual verdure, while all the country round was frozen to a great depth. Their monastery was built with lava, and roofed with a vault constructed of the light scoria, cemented with pozzuolana, or decayed basalt. During the summer time, as the Zeni relate, a great number of vessels arrived at Groenlandia from Norway and the islands to trade with the friars, who in exchange for their furs and fish received corn, woolen cloth, wood for fuel, and utensils of every description. With some of these articles, the friars maintained a trade with the people of the country. Monks from Sweden, Norway, and principally from Iceland resorted to this monastery, and during the winter season there was always a number of vessels in the harbor shut up by the ice and waiting for the return of spring. The boats used by the fishermen of Groenlandia had die shape of a weaver's shuttle, and were made of the bones of marine animals, covered with the skins of fish sewed one over the other. These boats were so strong and so watertight that the fishermen ventured fearlessly to launch with them into the roughest seas, satisfied that even if they were thrown upon a rock, they would sustain no injury. In all these particulars there is evidently a good deal of truth, incorrectly and fantastically combined. The volcanoes and boiling springs of Iceland, the fertile valley of Reykjavik, watered from tepid fountains, the well-endowed clergy of that island, are all transferred to a country in the west, where they are joined with the whale-skin canoes of the Eskimo. The situation which the Zeni assigned to Groenlandia in their map does not correspond with the actual position of the colony in Greenland, which was on the southern and not on the eastern coast of that country. We must therefore suppose either that the map of the Zeni was ill-constructed, or that their narrative is but a confused medley of hearsay accounts, or finally, which is most probable, that the descendant of Niccolo Zeno, who published the manuscript at Venice in 1558, attempted to embellish the original, and thus destroyed its circumstantial simplicity. But the most remarkable part of the map of the Zeni still remains to be examined. More than 1,000 miles to the west of Friesland, or the Faroe Islands, and to the south of Greenland, the Venetian voyagers placed 2 lines of coast, the one named Snio-land, the other Droseo. These countries are said to have been discovered in the following manner. A fishing vessel from the Faroe Islands, driven by a tempest far to the west, at length ran aground on the island called Snio-land. The inhabitants conducted the shipwrecked fishermen into a town well built and peopled, in which the chief or king resided. An interpreter who spoke Latin, and who, it appears, had also been shipwrecked on the island, was the first to communicate with them. They soon, however, learnt the language of the country. The country appeared to them of less extent than Iceland, but infinitely more fertile. In the center was a high mountain, from which 4 rivers descended. The inhabitants wrote in a character which the Northmen did not understand. Some Latin books were in the library of the king. The people of Snio-land carried on some trade with Groenlandia, whence they procured pitch, furs, and sulphur. They sowed corn, made beer, dwelt in houses built of stone, and were good seamen, although still unacquainted with the use of the compass. The Frieslanders, being provided with this instrument, were entrusted by the king with the conduct of an expedition directed towards a country situated farther to the south and called Drosio. They had the misfortune, however, to fall into the hands of a nation of cannibals. The Frieslanders were all eaten save one, whose life was spared on account of his dexterity in the art of fishing. The savages contended for the possession of so valuable a slave. Being handed over continually from one master to another, he had an opportunity of seeing the whole country. He affirmed that it was of unbounded extent and, in fact, a new world. The savage natives wore no covering. They were engaged in continual contests among themselves, the conqueror always feasting on his vanquished foe. Farther to the southwest were a people much more civilized, who were acquainted with the use of the precious metals, built large cities and temples, but nevertheless offered up human victims to their idols. Such was the account given by the fisherman of the Faroe Islands, when after a lapse of many years he returned to his country. An attempt was immediately made by the prince, who reigned there at the time, to reach these countries of Droseo and Snio-land, but storms drove his fleet into the seas of Greenland. Whether he repeated his efforts, and with what success, are alike unknown to us, the history of those voyages remaining incomplete. The narrative of the Zeni has been regarded by many as a mere fabrication, and the occurrence in it of such names as Daedalus and Icarus, which are evidently fabulous, seems to countenance that opinion. Yet the proportion of the miraculous and of palpable fable which is mingled with their relation does not exceed, perhaps, that which is found in the most authentic narratives of the Middle Ages. If the accounts of Snio-land and Droseo be merely fictions, they are fictions of a very plain and unattractive character. But in reality, fictions of this kind are extremely rare, for there are few persons who are capable of doing more than adding the adornments of fancy to a groundwork furnished by experience. But there is reason to believe that the Scandinavians never remitted their navigations in the northern seas. And if the inhabitants of the Faroe Islands had written histories like those of Iceland, we might from them also have received authentic accounts of lands discovered in the west and lost again in the course of ages. The name Snio-land appears to be Scandinavian and to mean the East Outland, as Newfoundland might be justly called with respect to the American continent. Those who are willing to believe the Zeni may suppose the inhabitants of Snio-land to have been descended from the Scandinavian settlers in Vinland, nor will their total disappearance at a later period seems surprising to those who reflect on the fate of the ancient colony of Greenland. The country called Droseo, according to the same course of reasoning, will be the coast of Nova Scotia or of New England, and the more civilized people to the south, who possessed the precious metals and offered up human sacrifices in magnificent temples, can be no other than the inhabitants of Florida, or perhaps the Mexicans, with whose wealth and power the hunter-savages of the north were probably well acquainted. However this may be, it is certain that the Zeni, in the 14th century, recalled to notice the well-authenticated discoveries made by the Scandinavians in the 10th, and added a relation which, whether true or false, contained the positive assertion of a continent existing to the west of the Atlantic Ocean. This relation was unquestionably known to Columbus, who may thus have derived not a little encouragement and instruction from the hardy navigations of the Northmen. This was Decoding Finnish History, and I salute you for hanging until the end. Until next time, respects.